All right, what's going on, guys? Dan Watson, and this is going to get interesting because this is the GH5 II, and I know exactly what you're thinking. No, this is not the GH6, although I do have some information on that camera, so stay tuned. We'll get into that. But as someone who owned the original GH5 and used it for basically all of my work for a few years, it was such an amazing camera, but at 4.5 years old, it was just having some trouble competing with a lot of the newer cameras out there. Now, earlier this year at the beginning, I predicted some really awesome things for Panasonic this year. Now, I also want to talk about Panasonic. What they really need to do is the GH6. I want to see 6K recording, 4K 120. Panasonic already has the best IBIS system, amazing screens, ergonomics, features. Combine all of that into a micro four thirds camera with a dual gain sensor, and they will do so amazing with something like a GH6. I really want to see that. Although I did not expect this camera at all, but I'm a little bit on the fence, and let's get into a little bit of why. So first, let's talk about the GH6, because Panasonic has basically done a development announcement for this camera. It will likely be released at the end of the year, and we know a little bit about it right now. It will have a brand new sensor and processor, so I expect big quality improvements on this one. It will also have 4K, 120, 10-bit, unlimited recording in 10-bit 422, 4K 60, so I'm guessing 4K 120 is going to be 10-bit 420, and 5.7K at up to 60 frames per second in 10-bit, so there are definitely some huge things to get excited about here. There are basically two things that I think Panasonic needs to improve for this camera. One is going to be the autofocus. The other is going to be high ISO, low light shooting. Those are really the two biggest weaknesses of a GH5 II, and if Panasonic throws in a dual ISO sensor, like they've got that kind of sensor in the GH5S, and they finally go full into phase detection autofocus, they could have an absolutely amazing camera. They have said it is a completely new sensor and a completely new processor, so we'll have to see, but we could see some big improvements in dynamic range, in low light. Who knows, maybe it's like stacked CMOS sensors and we can get internal HDR and all kinds of stuff. I don't know, maybe I'm dreaming, but I do think this will be a huge camera to really still put it in line with the GH5 II. Panasonic is releasing two cameras in 1 year, two GH cameras in 1 year, so I expect to see a pretty big difference between the GH5 II and the GH6. So why is the GH5 II even here if the GH6 is a couple months away? So the GH6 is definitely going to be more expensive. I don't have a firm price on this, but most likely I'm thinking it's going to be within the $2,000 to $2,500 range and potentially on the higher side of that, if not even higher. The GH5 II is much less expensive, under $2,000 on this one. So I'm glad Panasonic is not really increasing the price of this camera at all. Now, Panasonic also wants to keep the GH5 in their lineup for a few more years, and there was just only so much they could do with firmware updates. So they wanted to have a camera more in that $1,700 price range that people could get, and this is going to be the camera to do it with. They just didn't have the ability to improve things how they wanted to and get the interface the same and share parts with their newer cameras. You know, like this S1H right here. There is a lot of similarity between the GH5 II and the S1H. So let me know if you guys want to see a shootout between any of these cameras right here. We could do some comparisons. Maybe you want to get a Sony a7S III involved. I got some Blackmagic cameras, whatever you want. Let me know. I've got some cool shoots coming up with some exotic cars, so maybe we'll pull something out on that. So let me know. We'll get into that, but let's talk about the GH5 II. So let's get into exactly what's new with this camera. And if you saw a lot of the leaks and rumors, those were very misleading because a spec sheet will only tell you so much, and there is a lot new with this camera, more than I expected once I had kind of seen those leaks on here. So here's everything that we're seeing right now. So basically, the sensor is the same sensor from the GH5, although some new coatings have been added in order to help minimize reflections and things like flare that are coming from the sensor itself, not really flare from the lens or anything like that. Also, the color profiles from the S1H are going to make it here, so you got some new color science and a slight increase in dynamic range. Panasonic is quoting about 1/3 of a stop here. I don't have the old GH5 to really compare it, but you're going to see some very small improvements in image quality. Also, we have a modified version of a GH5 engine, which is actually pretty much the same engine that's in the S1H on this. And this is going to basically keep this camera in line with all the S1 cameras on this and going to allow Panasonic to share parts with those. Now that engine is going to allow a bunch of things to happen. You can now shoot 4K 60 in 10-bit. Before it was limited to 8-bit. That is using the entire sensor on this one, and then it is also no crop in that mode, no additional crop. So this is 420 though, not 422. 10-bit is the most important thing for me, so I'm really glad we have it. 4K 60 10-bit 420 is absolutely awesome. We also have Vlog included, so it is not a $100 purchase upgrade, which I hated about the original GH5. So that'll kind of save you $100 right here. Also, there is an improvement to the image stabilization system. They're quoting 6.5 stops, upgraded from 5. And that's awesome because this has basically one of my favorite image stabilization systems of any camera. Basically, they got the same motors that are in the G9. So just an upgraded, newer image stabilization system from their other cameras. There are also some big AF improvements here, but grain of salt with this one. This is essentially the same type of AF system, and there are some improvements with algorithms and the engine, and a lot of other things from the S1 cameras are coming in here. So that's where you're going to see most of the improvements here, but this is not like a redefined autofocus system. You do have a new LCD screen though, and that is noticeable. It is definitely brighter, resolution has been pumped, and just overall colors and things just look amazing on it. It's one of my favorite screens on any camera right now. There's also a slight upgrade on the viewfinder. So you're going from 60 frames per second refresh rate to 120. Other than that, the viewfinder is essentially the same, and it's a pretty good one. No problems at all with it. And the entire menu system with all of the features from the S1H, like dual zebras and all that kind of stuff, have made it in here. So really, this camera has become a mini S1H or a micro Four Thirds S1H in so many areas. You can also power the camera through USB-C now, and there are a ton of built-in live streaming options into the camera and into the app, and we're gonna get into those a little bit. So yeah, if you had looked at that spec sheet and saw like one or two things, there's a whole lot new with this camera here. So let's kind of get into the big technicals here and see how that really affects the system. So first of all, the hardware of this camera is brilliant. It is one of my favorite bodies to actually use. I miss having it. Tons of customization on here. You have dual card slots, UHS-2 V90 specs on this. Also, you have amazing battery life on this. Probably one of the best video camera battery life I've seen from these smaller mirrorless cameras. Full-size HDMI port, tons of customization via the touchscreen, lots of buttons on this camera. Also, it has some of the best stabilization you will find on any camera system. I drink coffee all day long. My hands shake like freaking crazy. And this is one of the only cameras that I can hand hold and make it look like it's on a gimbal. So absolutely amazing IS on this. The two massive reasons that this camera is kind of separated from almost anything else in this price range is anamorphic. This camera has the ability to shoot full anamorphic. It gives you a 4:3 readout. You have settings on here for anamorphic, and it can shoot it in 6K or 4K 60, and that is absolutely something that you just don't get on a whole lot of other cameras. And the other thing is going to be DCI. So the ability to shoot that 17:9 wider aspect ratio. Cameras like the A7S III and things like that do not give you that ability. Also, a lot of hybrid cameras like the Canon R6 and the Nikon Z6 don't give you those kinds of things in there. So this gives you full DCI recording, which is awesome, and that anamorphic option. So it is just an extremely powerful video camera. And the more I started using it, the more I realized how many big professional video features in here that you would expect from cinema cameras that cost $5,000, $10,000 are just stuffed into this tiny little mirrorless camera. Now 4K 60 is going to be H.265, 200 megabits per second, and 30 frames per second. You can also record in all I at 400 megabits per second. Or you can use long op at 150 megabits per second. So those are kind of your basic options on formats. So there are a growing number of cameras, even full frame cameras like the Z6 II and R6 that can shoot 4K 60, even 10-bit 4K 60, but they don't shoot 17:9 and they don't pull off anamorphic on here. So those are really the two big standout features on this camera versus other cameras on the market. But with this price range, it is pretty tough to find a lot of very good video cameras that can shoot 4K 60 at all in this kind of price range. Now, Panasonic has managed to improve a couple things with the image quality on this. So yes, we're getting a little bit more dynamic range, just a third of a stop. We're also getting the new color from the S1H. We're also getting new color profiles. We have Cinelike D, Cinelike V on here. We have a bunch of different profiles on this camera, and you now have Vlog built in. So a bunch of new things on it for image quality. However, low light is still going to be an issue. There's not an improvement on this. For me, about 1600 ISO is the most that I like to push this camera. Anything above 6400 is pretty much unusable in any case, so this is not going to compete with some of your full frame cameras in low light. Things like the A7S III are going to still hold a massive improvement. So let's talk autofocus, which is probably the main reason that I originally sold my GH5, is it just wasn't great in this area. Basically, if you are unhappy with that camera, you're probably not going to love this camera. And if you are happy with that camera or don't use autofocus all that much, this is now improved. So you're going to welcome the improvements right here. Basically expect a very similar performance to like the S1H or S1 series cameras here. Point to point, autofocus is great. It is super fast. It focuses really well. Even in low light, it managed to pull it off really well. What is new here is that with that new engine that's driving this and the new algorithms, we're noticing face and eye detection is now much better. It is picking up subjects much further away. Animal IAF is improved here. So overall, we're seeing a lot of new things here, but this is still contrast based. So anytime that I got into backlit situations, it struggled quite a bit. Also, you can sometimes notice it pulsating a little bit, and that can really drive you nuts. The good thing here is that with a switch, you can go from single to continuous to manual. So usually I would use continuous, and then if I noticed anything, I would just quick switch it into manual or go to single autofocus and then switch manual. So it's incredibly easy to kind of go between autofocus different modes depending on how the camera is performing. But just know this is not going to be, you know, up to the standards of Canon, Nikon, and Sony. Hopefully that is going to be in the GH6. But this camera does a much better job than before. It's usable in a couple of different areas, but in some it will still struggle just a bit. So we talked about it a little bit before, but yes, some hardware improvements are coming as well. So the viewfinder has been upgraded to 120 frames per second from 60. The screen is brand new as well, so it is now higher resolution, much brighter, colors look great on it, and touch response on this screen is absolutely excellent. So one of the best screens on the market here. Also, you do have a brand new battery, so 2200 milliamp hours versus 1800 on the previous one, so better battery life. Actually, this camera is probably the only one that I can make it through a wedding with 2 batteries. Usually I'm looking at 3 to 4 on virtually every other camera. So the battery life on this is absolutely amazing. Also, it still uses the same battery slot as the old camera, so your old batteries will work fine in this if you happen to have a GH5. Also, the battery grip will work as well, so no need to go buy replacement accessories for this. All right, so we do need to talk about this live streaming stuff because it is really unique, and even if you're not someone who live streams a lot now, this might change everything for you. So I don't live stream all the time, but when I do, I typically have this larger multicam setup with a stream deck and all this kind of hardware to be able to stream online using my computers and everything like that. I do not usually go live with just a single camera anywhere or outside of the studio, but with this camera, it simplified all of that, and I'll be honest, I might actually be using it a whole lot more with this camera. So basically you have an upgrade to the app itself and camera, so it will allow you to stream live on Facebook, YouTube, and some other ways straight from the app using your phone, or you can use a router directly. You don't need a computer at all, although you can do it through a computer as well. Also, there's a future hardware update coming to allow the ability to plug your phone in USB, so you don't have to do it wirelessly. So all of that is option, but this is so easy and simple. Literally, you just go into the app itself. You can look at the live streaming options right there. You can connect to the camera, and you can be live in just just a few clicks on Facebook or YouTube. So the only thing you should keep in mind is that you cannot simultaneously record in camera while live streaming using the phone and app system. However, the HDMI still works. So you can hook this up to a monitor, and you can also hook it up to an external recorder to capture that, but you cannot live stream from the app and the camera itself while simultaneously recording to the SD card. So honestly, the more I use this camera, the more I really found that it sets itself apart from just a lot of other cameras in the space. Probably my two favorite features are just being able to manually focus your lens linearly, and you can configure the response and how many degrees on there. You can also make micro adjustments to your shutter speeds and things like that. I shoot cars all the time and dealing with flicker, and having these kinds of abilities just helps out in so many areas. And I'm telling you, there are just hundreds of features like this in this camera that you just don't find on other cameras in this price range. So I think the big question is if this camera is still worth getting, and that one's a little bit tricky. So the GH5 II absolutely shines as a workhorse video camera without getting crazy expensive, and in many ways it feels like a $5,000–$10,000 cinema camera packed in to a camera like this. Panasonic basically made the GH5 II the micro four thirds version of the S1H at half the price, and that's absolutely incredible. It does have some really good strengths like anamorphic, being able to do that, being able to shoot cinema 17:9 4K on this one, but it still has two really big weaknesses, and I would say the autofocus system is going to be one of them, and the low light ability is going to be the other. I think if you're more of the hybrid kind of casual video shooter, being able to have autofocus and being able to have low light and maybe even better photo capabilities with cameras like the X-T4 or even the Nikon Z6 II in very similar price points might be a better solution. But for sure, if you were looking for something that gives you that $5,000 to $10,000 cinema camera and all of those video features, and you can live without shooting over 1600 ISO and with limited autofocus or manual focus only, this is just such an incredible camera, and it really improves things in ways that are actually usable. The GH5 II kept the price pretty low, and it feels a bit more current than the last generation cameras. So let me know what you guys think about the camera. I know we're still drooling over the potential GH6 coming later this year, so stay tuned. We'll get that in. We'll put it through some crazy tests on that one. But in the meantime, let me know if there's anything you want to see with this camera, any shoots you want me to do. I've got a couple things lined up already. Stay tuned, subscribe, like if you haven't already. Hope you guys are doing amazing. I'll see you soon in a new video.